I wrote a paper on Turkey in 2012, and it was on the Turkey and the EU, the context changes. And it was a paper noting that the debate about Turkey's entrance into the EU was taking place in 2012 in a very different context from what it had been 5 years earlier. Now it's only been 2 years since I gave the paper, and yes, a couple of extra months. But the subtitle of the talk today is "The Context Changes Again." The EU is not the same organization it was 2 years ago. I mean, yes, it is, but it's a very different situation. Turkey has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. Turkish politics have dramatically shifted. And as we all know, the situation in the Middle East has really changed dramatically. When I wrote the previous paper, we were still in the throes of the Arab Spring. So there was a great deal of concern about where this was all going to go. And for example, what would happen in Egypt, because Morsi had just managed to make it into the position of leadership. But now, 2 years later, the Arab Spring is dead as a doornail, and the situation is very different. We're back to very, well, conservative is the nice word, regimes, and that was not the case 2 years ago. So some of what I'm going to say is very critical, I think, of Erdogan, who's the Turkish leader. But just be clear at the beginning, he is in a tight spot, really tight spot. There's a great deal of pent-up concerns within Turkey that he's got to balance. He's in this broader Middle Eastern context, which is changing right on his doorstep. The country is overflowing with Syrian refugees. And the international context is changing not beyond the Middle East. So you have a shifting situation with Russia, for example, which, as I will explain, has affected Turkey directly because of pipeline plans that have suddenly rather changed. Now, I'm going to take this off so it won't be so hot. As I think I said a month ago when I gave a different talk, this is as far as I go. Just So in that context, let me lead you through it. Turkey, everybody get a handout?
Yes.
Okay, good. Turkey's initial application for full EU membership was back in 1987. And that was at the same time as Morocco applied to be a member. The Moroccan case was immediately dismissed. Essentially, the EU said very politely, forget about it. And the reason that they gave Morocco was that Morocco was not sufficiently European. They entertained the Turkish application, but it was not until 1995, which happened to be the same year as Austria and Finland and Sweden joined the EU, that the EU agreed to enter into a customs union with Turkey. This is a very significant step. It means they get a lot of the EU trade preferences without being a member. So it's one of those little things that tend to be forgotten but have been very significant in the whole situation, that Turkey is already to some extent privileged within the EU even though they're not yet members. After 2004, the number of EU member states expanded rapidly, and if you're doing your counting, you know today it's 28 members. Look again tomorrow, it could be 27 or 26, because there are issues in places like Greece about how long the EU will remain the EU. But it was not really until 2005 that the EU agreed to start formal negotiations with Turkey about membership. Applied 1987, 2005, the EU took up the case formally and started negotiations. And immediately there were roadblocks. Austria's People's Party and Germany's CDU under Merkel declared that Turkey should be content with some sort of privileged partner status in the EU and not think about membership. And then President Sarkozy of France said the same thing. And furthermore, he said before Turkey can get into the EU from France's standpoint, where we won't veto it, it'll have to be a referendum in France. I mean, even if the EU accepts Turkey, there'll have to be a referendum in France. You know, that was the kiss of death. So things were not looking at all good. Recently, President Francois Hollande has been a little more encouraging. He went to Istanbul and he made nice noises and talked about possible future admission of Turkey probably being a good idea when all the issues were sorted out, et cetera, et cetera. But so far, he has not budged on the matter of a referendum. He's not changed his mind publicly about that. Well, in 2012, when I wrote the previous paper, they had restarted negotiations that had gone nowhere after 2005. They talked and they talked and they talked, but nothing happened. And in 2012, the EU Minister for Enlargement visited Istanbul, and with a great deal of fanfare and some state banquets and so forth, announced that this time everybody's serious. We're really going to start this thing and get it finished. And he said that he brought encouraging news, which that the EU might soon ease visa restrictions on Turkish citizens and perhaps ultimately eliminate them entirely. Well, in 2013, negotiations were suspended because of concerns over political developments in Turkey, and then they were reinstated and have begun again this last year. And in fact, Turkey and the EU did sign a very significant agreement regarding return of illegal migrants and so on. I'll get back to that in a minute. Very significant, along with the Trade Customs Union that dated way back. But still a long way from a meeting of minds here. And in fact, Erdogan went to Brussels on a sort of lobbying mission about the EU, or it was a cross between a sort of state visit in which he was demonstrating his authority in Turkey, but also to tell the Europeans it was high time they got serious. And it was a very tense meeting. It was very tense. He did not receive a very cheerful meeting at all. And he said some rather blunt things about European biases and so on, very sort of, quite frankly, rather undiplomatic things. I think he was trying to shock them a bit, and he succeeded in doing that. And at the end of the meeting, the press reports were very gloomy, saying, in effect, it was a most unpleasant visit and probably hadn't helped the situation at all. Well, today, Turkish accession to the EU doesn't seem any closer than it did some years ago. There are 35 chapters or policy areas that set forth in the EU agreement the areas where member states must comply with European policy. And the way the EU does with new members is negotiate. They open up negotiations on each chapter individually, sometimes a group of them at the same time. And once they're satisfied that the country has met the standards, that chapter is closed and another chapter is open. Well, of those 35, negotiations have only been opened in all these years on 14 chapters. Now, you can do your math. 35 minus 14 leaves quite a few, and of course they are the hardest one. And in fact, 8 chapters are completely closed to negotiation because they affect indirectly or directly Cyprus. And Turkey does not recognize the existence of an independent Cyprus because of the fact that the island, of course, is split. Half Cyprus, which is a member of the EU, and the Turkish portion of Cyprus, which is not. And it's been a continuing thorn between Turkey and the EU. I thought it was very interesting because I followed these debates. The contest over the new Secretary General or the principal secretariat person in the EU, which there was campaigning for, you remember last year, and Claude Juncker, who finally got the job, was running against, at the end of the day, Martin Schulz. And they held in Germany a series of televised debates, like our presidential debates. And both candidates said that they would, if elected, and Juncker, of course, was elected, they would oppose Turkish admission to the UN. And Juncker went so far as to say he thought the EU was already perhaps too big, and under his leadership, he would guarantee and promise to everyone listening to this program that for 5 years there would be no new EU members admitted. So, you know, that didn't bode well once he ascended to whatever power he has. Well, what have been the issues over these years? I think I mentioned some of them indirectly. One is the question of whether Turkish culture and Muslim orientation, religious-wise, is sufficiently European. The fact is that this has been a concern. It's not a very pretty concern in many respects, but realistically, there it is. Turkish population in 2013, which is the last figure I've seen that seems reliable, was about 76.7 million. Now, this is not a giant country, but it would make the EU's, it would make the second largest EU representation, sorry, I'll get it in a minute, the second largest delegation to the EU Parliament after Germany's. In other words, the size of this, which is relevant to population, they would be second to Germany in the EU. And Germany's birth rate, if you follow Europeans, is next to nil. In fact, almost a minus birth rate these days, except for immigration. You know, I don't know what the Germans do for entertainment at night, but they're not producing kids. The Turkish birth rate is much higher. So just projecting, it would not be more than 5 years or so before the Turkish delegation would be the largest. And this is a matter of political concern. Maybe Europe is already too Turkish. That's some of the argument. Most estimates are that there are about 3 million Turks in Europe, about half in Germany, with significant numbers in Austria, and Belgium, and France, and Netherlands, and the UK. In fact, the Turkish residents represent about 2% of Germany's population, 4% of Austria's, and a little less than 1% of the UK's population. They're not really a huge number in the UK. If you've been to the UK, you know that there are an enormous number of non-British folks that come from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and so on. But in that group that is not sort of European in Britain, the Turks are not a huge majority, and they've been there a long time. There have been some notable shifts over the years in immigration to Europe, and it's changing very quickly. This, I think, is an important point that most people do not understand or appreciate. Turkish migration to Europe goes way, way back, long before there was anything like the EU. I won't go through the history, but it's a very interesting history. And there was a big upsurge in the 1960s when Europe, already beginning to hurt for not enough labor, allowed visiting workers from Turkey to come for a limited stay. Well, these programs usually end up with most of the people never going home, and that's actually what happened. So many Turks came during the 1960s, particularly to Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, France, and Sweden, the same countries we were talking about earlier. Then Turkish immigration slowed, beginning in the 1990s, for two reasons. Europe became more restrictive. That guest worker program was phased out. And Turkey became more prosperous. So there was less reason for Turkish immigrants to leave, or to emigrate. And in fact, that has been the case until fairly recently, when partly because of the Kurdish conflict and a lot of other asylum seekers, mainly Kurdish asylum seekers, there were a lot of Kurds coming in recent decades. However, that has now slowed, and the latest studies, and this is the point that I think few people understand or appreciate, the latest studies are showing that Turkish immigration to Europe is virtually nil now. And in fact, there is a return migration, partly because Europe is more restrictive, partly because, and mainly, I suppose, because Turkey is generally rather more prosperous, and the Turkish are going home. Bottom line, I've given you this long spiel, but the bottom line is there's hardly any Turkish immigration these days into Europe that is legal and the usual sort of thing, nor much prospect that this is even going to be an issue in the future. It's a dead issue for all practical purposes. With the exception, and here's the tricky part. The concern that Turkey is a halfway station for refugees and immigrants over the entire Middle East and elsewhere, a kind of backdoor to Europe for a lot of others. So Europe isn't so much worried about the Turks. Not only are they not that large a portion of the population, but they've been there, the ones that are there have been there a long time. These are established families. They're second, third generations. I mean, they are fairly well assimilated into society, even if they haven't, changed their culture. They're old and established. Let's put it this way. They're not riots in Turkish communities. These are not radical Islamic fundamentalists in those areas. It's not like the suburbs of Paris, which are ready to explode any minute. The Turks are, they're settled, reliable. Most of them are in business, small businesses. They're very successful. It's like the Latino population in San Antonio, where I grew up. I mean, they've been there for so long, nobody can remember when they weren't there. And they're successful. They're in business, small business, big business, social register, you know. All this is happening with the Turkish community. So less in-migration directly of Turks, established second and third generation families sometimes, but the concern still is Turkey being used as a way into Europe, and particularly if matters get even worse, if it's hard to imagine they could get worse, in the Middle East. And the border has been very leaky, and not just Turkey, but Greece and a few other places, where refugees are finding their way in. That is the background of that latest agreement with the EU. Turkey has agreed that in the event illegal immigration happens from Turkey, then the EU can send back these people, and Turkey will accept them. The other side of the coin is that the EU has agreed to consider, as I said earlier, lifting visa restrictions for Turkish immigrants and allowing more of them to come more easily than in the past. I think actually this is an issue that's still a matter of friction, particularly the backdoor to Europe problem. But it's not the main barrier these days. Sure, there are right-wing parties in Europe, and they're getting stronger. It's really a very ugly scene, and one I think we all have to watch. It's part of a kind of illiberal shift in democracies that I see in many different places. I mean, Russia is just a clear, startling example of that, and we're seeing some of it in Turkey in a different way. But the rise or return of the right wing, which started with just a few crazies in places like Austria, is now a real feature of European politics. And for these people, they don't make distinctions. I mean, Turks are just more of those others that they don't, in fact, want in their pristine, pure European settings, which long ago stopped being pristine, pure. But, you know, enough of those other people. That's their attitude. They don't care whether they're Turks or Syrians or Egyptians. I mean, they don't want them. And unfortunately for the Turks, who I think are really in a different category entirely, or should, because they're hard to, they get lumped in, refugees and others. They're tarred with the same brush, by the way. So it's very unfortunate. Now, done all this. So much for those notes. Another problem, Cyprus. You know the background of this. The supporters of, thank you, of the union between Greece and Cyprus staged a coup in 1974. And a third of the island declared itself to be the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and the Turks sent in troops to support that. Well, ever since then, the Turkish government has refused to recognize the existence of Cyprus, and they were particularly incensed that Cyprus was made a member of the EU over the opposition of some EU members. They weren't willing to vote no, which would have kept Cyprus out, but they cautioned that this could be a provocative move, and it was. And all this was particularly embarrassing when through rotation, Cyprus became to assume the presidency of the EU 1 year, and the Turks refused to attend any meeting at which the Cyprus people presided. That sort of, not even as an observer. They wouldn't even come and petition to such a meeting. They absolutely refused. So it really highlighted the essential problems. Now that's where it was in 2012. There's a new wrinkle here. And again, something most people don't know about. Recently, there has been the discovery of a giant oil field, potentially petroleum field, in the Mediterranean off the coast of Cyprus. This is potentially huge. Now, unfortunately, for the impact of this, we recently had the slump in oil prices, which means it's not quite as urgent as it might have been a couple of years ago. But what this did, well, to get the oil out, the easiest thing to do would be to exploit it and ship it via pipeline under the water to Turkey, and use Turkey as the place where the oil would then flow to the world market. So suddenly both Cyprus and Turkey have an interest in sort of smoothing over their relations. So in 2012, the talks that had been on and off, but mostly off for many years, started again. And it was much more encouraging. Both sides, instead of standing up at every meeting and denouncing the sins of the others, suddenly began saying nice things about peace and reconciliation, how we're sure we can find ways of solving. So I can't resist saying, you know, the oil sort of greased the talks. But it was almost too good to be true. I mean, with the slump in oil prices and the usual animosities, the last I heard, which was a few weeks ago, they're slipping back into the usual pattern of recriminations and, well, you know, we're willing to agree to this, but you're not willing to agree to it. So it looks like they're not going to get anywhere for the time being. If, you know, mark my words, I have a few things I'm willing to predict, but I'm willing to predict that if the oil prices go up again, the talks will start up again, and much more seriously. But meanwhile, there have been issues about other pipelines coming into Turkey, and I'll get to that in a minute. The big thing has been, in terms of a barrier, has been Turkish politics and the EU's concern about political freedoms in Turkey. This is not just an excuse. Yes, there has been prejudice over the years against Turkey because of its different culture. But this is a true, sincere concern on the part of the EU about human rights violations. They've got enough problems in the EU about human rights violations at the moment. If you've been following events in Hungary, for example, and the rise of right-wing parties, you know, there are nasty folks out there who are not particularly supportive of human rights and are fairly bigoted. But the question is, do they need another one like that? And this has been something that's been a problem. Well, for those of you who follow Turkey at all, you know that back in 2002, the AK party was led by Erdogan, the gentleman pictured on the front of your handout, and then Abdullah Gül, co-founded the AK, won elections in 2002. And this was sort of a tectonic shift moment in the history of Turkish politics. This was a coalition that argued for a more Muslim Islamic state, arguing always and still arguing a moderate Islamic state, not a radical Islamic state. But just how radical or how moderate has made a lot of people nervous, not only outside of Turkey, but I talked to some of my Turkish friends within Turkey. And certainly was contrary to the long-standing position after the Ataturk revolution that this was going to be a modern, secular, westernized country. So I say a tectonic shift. It was. However drastic is still the question, one of the questions at hand. Well, Gül was the first prime minister, and then Erdogan, he was barred for a while being prime minister for various reasons. He read a religious poem, and the government wouldn't allow him to become president. It was a political rally. But that was smoothed over, and he became Gül, and he switched positions, sort of like Putin. And remember Medvedev some time back. But it had always been planned that Erdogan would assume the presidency, and he finally was allowed to, the prime ministership, rather, at that time. So Erdogan won 3 successive terms as prime minister. And in 2014, got 52% of the vote to become Turkey's first directly elected president. They had changed the constitution so that the president was popularly elected directly rather than appointed like a prime minister from the parliament. Now, what they haven't managed to change is the fact that still technically the principal legal head of state in Turkey is the prime minister. Yes, the president has now been elected rather than appointed, but the president in the Constitution is a figurehead sort of president, not the main person. When Erdogan was elected president, he made it very clear that he didn't care about the Constitution anyway. He was going to be president and the principal leader, and in fact, Gül, who criticized him for this and other reasons, was essentially edged out. So his partner from the beginning is now on the sideline. And Erdogan has his goal clearly set to be not only the elected president, but the main political, I'm going to use a slightly pejorative term, sultan of Turkey. And what this is going to require ultimately to get it all settled is a change in the Constitution again. And that is what the elections that are forthcoming next June are to probably determine. These will be parliamentary elections. You can mark your calendar. It's June 15th, a very significant date for Turkey. If the AK party gets 2/3 of the vote in that election, which is not guaranteed by any means, it would be doing better than in the past, then the parliament alone could change the Constitution. It would not require a vote of the people. If they get a 3/5 majority, there would have to be a national referendum on this, but it still could be proposed. So Erdogan's goal here, quite clearly, is to get that 2/3 majority, if he possibly can, and to avoid a referendum. There's still a great deal of debate among my Turkish friends and academics and others about whether he will actually get the majority, and no one really knows, except that I'm betting he will. By hook, or possibly by crook. I have a lot of admiration for him in many respects as a political leader. He is a very smart as a fox politician. Very, very shrewd, and also fairly ruthless. I'm being quite frank. I think he'll get his majority, one way or another. In a way, I hope I'm wrong. I really do. But because I think in the long run, it will be a serious threat to the continuation of Turkish freedoms and potential lifetime dictatorship. It's a slide back in the wrong direction, but that's kind of where we are. Why am I concerned? Well, particularly in the last few years, when Erdogan had to face a series of elections, each one of which was more important to him than the last, there has been an assault on political freedoms in the country. Turkey now has more journalists in jail than China. Now that's not a very good statistic because, as we know, there are not many journalists in China. They're real journalists. So it's kind of a falsehood. But the fact is, the International Association of Journalists singles out Turkey as the worst offender in the world as far as jailing journalists. Most of these are journalists who it was said was close to the Kurdish opposition and therefore supportive of, quote, terrorism. But a goodly number of them are those that just simply had the courage to criticize things that were happening in the country. There's also been an attempt to shut down or censor social media that is almost unprecedented. Take Twitter, for example. I'm not a big tweeter myself, but Twitter reported in the second half of 2014 that requests to take down posts on Twitter. The number was such in Turkey that 90% of all such requests came from Turkey in the second half. And that's pretty significant when you think of the fact that Twitter is all around various places. And here's one country that seems to be very sensitive about posts, to say the least. There have been laws about various sedition. There was a law early on, the infamous Article 301, in which if you insulted the Turkish nation or the state or the Grand Assembly, you could be imprisoned for that. And a number of prominent people, including a Nobel Prize-winning novelist, were brought up on charges. There's no sense of humor at all about criticism or mocking, which is unfortunate because Turkey has a tradition in journalism rather like the Danes of having satirical cartoonists who have been satirizing government figures for generations. This is just what they do, and the Turkish public loves it. In the same way that, I don't know, don't you and I enjoy American politicians being satirized in the press? You see pictures of them in various unflattering poses with their ears exaggerated or their mouth exaggerated. And this no sense of humor about this now. Also, there have been a series of demonstrations which have been suppressed. During the Arab Spring, there was a large demonstration in Taksim Square, a major square in Istanbul, opposing turning the major park in Istanbul into a large shopping center and mall and businesses, etc. And this really didn't go well. It was also picked up by critics of Erdogan as a moment to embarrass him. So there were hordes of people out there. And after a very brief period during which there were no negotiations with the demonstrators whatsoever, the water cannons came in and the place was cleared out. and I won't go through the litany, but trust me, if I would start listing all the times in which the government has confronted the media or complained about plots against Turkey, we'd be here really for the rest of the day. The most serious problems have come around election time, as you might imagine. And in each case, Erdogan has been very intemperate in his language. This is a man who does not mince words. And typically, when there's been a demonstration or a critical article in the press, or one other major event, which was a corruption investigation that was terribly embarrassing to him, his list of complaints is that this is an attempt of inside sedition. The Kurds, the socialists, the nationalists who would like to go back to a secular regime, or Israeli agitators, or US CIA agitators. Anybody is on his list when he's complaining about having been criticized in the press. The corruption thing happened last December. It was a major scandal, December 17. Police arrested 50 people under suspicion of bribery and rigging contracts and illicit gold transfers to Iran. There were 3 cabinet members who were implicated, and they all had to resign. And a major mayor of one of the AK-dominated towns, and the manager of the state's second largest state lender, Halbach. And then the prosecutors ordered a second range of raids that targeted one of Erdogan's sons. And this really did not go down well. And Erdogan replied, and I think I was reminded at the time, most of you are too young to remember, but the Saturday night massacre that Nixon pulled when the prosecutors were getting really close to him, almost finding the evidence that would have impeached him. He fired the prosecutors, the whole bunch. It really didn't help him in the end, but that is essentially what Erdogan did. He claimed a sort of national emergency here, a plot against the government, and this is connected with another ongoing saga in Turkey, which I have to mention now. Erdogan and the Gülenists. Gülen is a major guru-like figure who lives in Pennsylvania, by the way, in a heavily guarded estate. And he is a philanthropist. He's raised enormous money to open religious schools. He's really a devout Muslim. He's interested in increasing Islamic awareness in Turkey. But his general message is fairly benign. He believes in faiths getting together, and peace between different religions. He is not all that hostile to Israel. And furthermore, just in general, much more anti-Iran than even the Turkish government has been from time to time. And the relations there have been relatively close at various times. So Gülen has a different orientation from Erdogan, but they were allies for a long period of time. And in the early days of the Erdogan regime, the Gülenists in the police, where they were particularly represented, were important in rounding up some of the generals who were left over from the pre-AK days and longing for more secularism. And they helped Erdogan neutralize the generals, and a number of them were tried for plotting coups and other things. Well, what has now happened is Erdogan has decided that the Gülenists were behind the corruption, and it was behind the corruption investigation. It was an attempt by them to create what he has called a parallel state, which of course he tolerated for a long period of time as long as it was serving his purposes. And there has been a very continuing purge of Gülenists from every facet of Turkish life, beginning with the police and the judiciary and the prosecutor's office and the like. He's fired innumerable people. He's moved around police from their traditional assignments to other assignments as a way of breaking their networks. It's been a massive campaign to neutralize the Gülenists, and he's even asked President Obama to extradite Gülen from Pennsylvania to be tried on various charges that the Turkish government has begun to compile. So maybe this was inevitable. These are two sort of charismatic personalities, and it may be that two charismatic personalities like that cannot coexist without a power struggle at some time or another. I don't know whether it was inevitable, but it certainly happened now. They're completely split. And interestingly enough, which illustrates the sly fox dimension of Erdogan again, he's begun to go back and court some of the secular generals that he had previously prosecuted. He claimed that some of the trials were cooked up by the Gülenists, and now he's offering to have these generals retried so as to clear their name of any case. So he was relying heavily on Gülenists, and now he's relying on the government has regarded the Kurds as dangerous at best and terrorists at worst. And indeed, there's a small sector of the PKK, the Turkish Kurds, who are terrorists. I mean, they're like the IRA was in Ireland. But you know, most of the Kurds aren't part of this. The Kurdish leader has been in jail for decades and is anxious always for reconciliation, or most of the time, except when he gets too irritated with the persecutions. And a lot of the human rights violations were not only journalists and others, but also things done to the Kurds. An awful lot of Kurds in jail or exiled for very shifty reasons in many cases. I mean, sure, there was some reason to be worried, but they have been persecuted. There's no other word for it. So recently, however, there's been a slight rapprochement with the Kurds, which almost fell apart. You remember reading about the town of Kobani, perhaps, on the Syrian border? Kurdish town, being threatened by ISIS. And they were pleading for Turkish help to keep from being overrun. These are the Syrian Kurds, who, from the vantage point of Turkey, are even more terrorists than the domestic Kurds. And Turkey pointedly refused not only to come to their aid, but also refused to allow Turkish territory to be used as by others to assist the town. And only at the last moment was there a kind of shift in position to allow some assistance for Kobani. But that almost blew the negotiations that had seemed to be a little bit promising with the Kurds out of the water. Now, however, though, the election is coming up in June. And one of the things you can say about Turkey, even though there are, of course, electoral violations, is that the elections have heretofore been relatively free. So Erdogan has to worry about the Turkish vote. And indeed, in 2014, which was before Kobani, his party got quite a bit of the Turkish vote because the Turks regarded his overtures for a possible settlement to be more believable than the opposite. And so most of the Turks voted for Erdogan as opposed to even the Kurdish candidate, who was not a very strong candidate in any event. So there was a rapprochement, then Kobani, and now, just a couple of days ago, I could have handed this out. The Kurdish leader in prison has announced that he's optimistic about some sort of rapprochement over this is all politics, folks. It's at the end of the day, we'll just see. But I think the Kurds in general regard Erdogan as the least worst of the possibilities for some sort of a reconciliation. So we'll have to watch the June 15 thing. Now, I'm going to go quickly over the economy because this is one area to explain Erdogan's appeal. The economy was pretty much in the dumps when he was elected. And although there have been setbacks over the years, and right now the lira, Turkish lira, and the economy is definitely in a slump, partly because of political instability in the country over the uncertainty about the future. And there's a huge debt that the current account situation in Turkey is very delicate. They have to have a continual inflow of foreign capital in order to meet their debt obligations. So they're worried a lot about that. But overall, the economy has improved considerably over the years with pluses and minuses. There's been a boom in construction and automotive industry and general things related to infrastructure. And I might add that in the Human Rights Department, even though Erdogan has been very blunt in public about the fact that he doesn't think women are anywhere near the equal of men. I mean, he's made statements about the delicate condition of women and how they have to be treated differently because they're so delicate. It's, you know, it's male chauvinism of the worst kind, but it is, he's reflecting conservative Islam here. But even at the same time, he vastly improved over the years women's rights in Turkey. For example, in the past, under previous regimes, women had no legal rights. In a marriage, for example, no divorce, or certainly no rights if there were a divorce, no rights to children, various discriminatory features in the workplace, and so on. And to his credit, he and the AK party changed some of those rules to make conditions better for women in Turkey in a significant way. And you've got to pay credit where credit is due. And a lot of the money that the government got, that it didn't corrupt away in some form or another, because corruption is very bad, went to building better bridges, building better roads, improving the educational system, a lot of new national universities, for example. So, in general, this is the source of Erdogan's appeal. Yes, many people would say he's not a very nice man. He's a big egotist. He's practically a megalomaniac in some respects. But he's done things for Turkey. And few people have done things for Turkey over the years. So and the opposition has been poorly organized and has put forth candidates, for the most part, that have just not been appealing. It's a sad situation, rather than, I don't want to stretch this too far, but a little bit like Russia, where there are plenty of well-minded reformers who are desperately opposed to the kind of illiberal democracy, if you won't even call it democracy anymore, that Putin has established. But they can't seem to get their act together. And when they start to, somebody's jailed or exiled, and in the last week, of course, killed. So it's comparable. The opposition to Erdogan can't get its act together. They're split, they're divided, there are personality problems between the leaders. And so he is, if nothing else, determined, smart, foxy, and ruthless. And I'm not sure being ruthless is too bad a qualification for a president. I sometimes think, you know, in a country as divided as Turkey is, in a place in the Middle East where Turkey is, ruthless may be necessary. There's good ruthless and bad ruthless. So I have a lot of admiration for his accomplishments, and I can understand how many in Turkey still support him, because there's not much of an alternative that they can see. But the economic situation is very fragile, and the downturn in oil prices has hurt them. And if interest rates, here's our globalized world for you, if interest rates rise in the United States and in Europe, which doesn't look too likely any place but the UK, that will drain off some of that foreign investment in Turkey, which right now goes there because it's the only place you can get a decent return. If interest rates rise, there's going to be a drain from the Turkish economy. And in fact, even before the oil crunch, there were rumors. You remember the Fed was talking about possibly raising rates, and they're now doing this. The moment the rumors came out, the Turkish lira shot down, and the amount of FDI, foreign direct investment into the country, dropped dramatically. So they're in a rocky situation. I personally would not, let's put it this way, I'd be very careful about investing in Turkey now. I want something that was pretty much a sure thing. And I would not be, for example, investing in Turkish banks or in various dicey infrastructure projects. But there have been some great ones in that area. For example, a new tunnel under the Bosphorus. I mean, that was a major achievement, you know, dreamed of like the railroad to the West in the early days of the United States. Major engineering feat and highly celebrated. There have been various pipeline projects, and the latest, which I can't really spend time talking about, was the cancellation by the Russians of their South Stream pipeline project, which was highly controversial. May never have happened anyway, but was their means of circumventing Ukraine and getting gas to some of the Russian semi-clients like Serbia in Europe. Putin canceled that project right after the sanctions were imposed. Now, it was in financial difficulty anyway, and it was really doubtful whether he was going to get permission, partly because the EU had opposed, had insisted that, had put conditions on the South Stream project that made it less profitable and less of a monopoly than, or potentially would have done, than Russia would have liked. But at any rate, it was peremptorily canceled. And now there's a new pipeline supposedly going to be built, also circumventing Ukraine, essentially, and sending gas to Turkey directly. And Putin has said the Europeans are going to have to build their own pipelines to connect to this one to get the gas that's now going to be shipped to Turkey. This was a big financial coup, of course, and great publicity for the Turkish regime. And your handout here says that Erdogan wonders why no one comes around anymore. Well, Putin came around. Foreign policy is the last thing. Turkey's a member of NATO. Most people don't even know that. It has been a loyal member of NATO, mostly loyal until the last few years. They sent troops to Afghanistan, for example, and the size of the Turkish military is second only to that of the United States in NATO. I mean, that's not nothing. The NATO forces have dwindled to practically nothing, which is one of the reasons why there has not been a more dramatic response to Ukraine. What? You want us to send all our 5 soldiers to Ukraine? It's a difficult situation. Well, Turkey has pretty good military and pretty well trained and with a long and distinguished history, as well as meddling in politics. They did accept. Turkey did accept an American-designed missile shield to be, at one stage, to be stationed on Turkish soil. And occasionally, NATO planes are allowed to use Turkish bases, and that's been one of the issues with regard to ISIS, how much of that will be allowed. But here again, all kinds of problems. NATO frequently, when it comes to Middle Eastern problems, has wanted Israel to be an observer at the NATO meetings. Turkey announced that they would not attend any NATO meeting at which Israel was allowed in the room, let alone as an observer. And the rhetoric, the anti-Israeli rhetoric, has ratcheted up, and tensions over things like the death of Turkish citizens in the Gaza ship, you remember. It's ratcheted up around election times. Erdogan goes out and makes noises about foreign intervention in the country, about CIA plots, about Wall Street, about Israelis, all of these things. He uses this rhetoric, and of course it doesn't go down very well with his NATO allies. In general, Turkey has opposed sanctions on Iran, and indeed has been trying to find ways of, so they argue, mediating the nuclear crisis with Iran. They've come up with various plans, some of them quite harebrained, about how there could be various swaps with Brazil, etc. Again, we've been here all afternoon and talked about those negotiations, but it's been a strange situation. But one thing is clear: Erdogan's ambition is to reactivate, and I can appreciate why he's doing this, Ottoman influence in the Middle East. I don't think he wants or has any dreams of reestablishing, unlike Putin on the other side, the empire again. I don't think he really has that in mind, but he'd like Ottoman influence to call the shots in the Middle East. He's a long way from doing this. His foreign policy in general has been pretty much a disaster. He backed the Morsi government very strongly in Egypt, and that was a bust. It has not improved his relations with the Egyptian military, who are now quite clearly, for at least the foreseeable future, in control in Egypt. He was very anxious to overthrow Assad. That was in Syria. That was his principal theme. He kept hammering on the need to get rid of Assad. He couldn't get anybody to listen to this. In the end, he's been caught up in the Syrian civil war, which started out Assad on the one side, rebels against Assad on the other side, and now has become ISIS and the whole general crisis in the region. Turkey is inundated with Syrian refugees, thousands of them. Thousands came across the border in one weekend last autumn. And they're housed in huge refugee camps not far from the border, and conditions there are horrible. And indeed, one of the criticisms the Europeans now have is that the Turks ought to do a little something to make, they appreciate the fact that Turkey took the refugees, but ought to do a little bit better in terms of humanitarian conditions in those camps. So that's an issue too. In the beginning, President Obama went to Istanbul at the beginning of his administration and gave a thrilling speech about how Turkey was a model democracy and a moderate religious country, which should be a model to all who aspire to honor their religious traditions, and what would be a shining beacon to the rest of the Middle East. You know, he really pulled out all the stops, as only he can do when he gets warmed up with his rhetoric. Well, a couple years later, a couple of confrontations with the Israelis, etc., a few criticisms of the United States interfering in Turkish affairs, etc., prodding over Assad, etc. Let's put it this way, relations with the U.S. are not going well right now. I think if you read the piece, Mr. Erdogan himself said he was puzzled by his country's lack of friends. If Turkey appeared isolated, it was because other leaders were jealous. Well, he didn't say what. When Obama came to office, we got along very well, he added. Afterwards, things began to change, and I don't know why. Well, you know, any fool knows why. You can't be rhetorically anti-West and stridently anti-Israel, uncooperative in NATO, which has been the recent situation, unwilling to contribute to the battle against ISIS, because they've been playing both sides against the middle. Turkey has not committed that army to this in the way that, of course, the Jordanians did and the Saudis did. But in these cases, you know, there were cases of direct provocations. Jordan went in because its nationals were killed. Yes, there were some Turkish hostages for a while, but they were negotiated out. And Turkey doesn't have a direct state. But I'm sure if there are some Turkish citizens rounded up and publicly beheaded and videotaped, the Turkish, there'll be some bombers sent in to bomb a few ISIS people. But it is a difficult relationship. So just to sum up finally, after all this time, the EU talks are, again, sort of stalled. It's not Turkish culture, primarily. It's not immigration anymore, realistically. It's concerns over the kind of regime that Europe would be letting in. Yes, they've got problems with, internal problems with right-wing parties. Yes, they've got Orban in Hungary causing great concern. But they just don't feel this is a kind of European, public-spirited, minded country. And I think they're sincere in that. I don't think fundamentally it's biased. They just are not ready to swallow this, another illiberal regime. The Turkish economy is fragile, but doing much better than it did many years ago. Erdogan is set to become Sultan for life. and the democracy will be effectively dead unless something that is difficult to see could happen does happen in the June 15 elections. That's really worth watching the papers for, because this is a very significant moment in Turkey's history. And much in the long run will depend upon how important Turkey is as an ally of the West and the United States. I mean, at the end of the day, the Europeans and Washington can swallow a regime that they don't much like. I mean, look, they've dealt with the Saudis all these years. If need be. Somehow the human rights violations and things get swept under the rug when you need somebody. And if Turkey is a bastion of reasonable, not really too much of a problem, there might be ways of Turkey still getting into the EU. I think I said 2 years ago, I'll stop with this, that I really didn't think Turkey would ever get into the EU, and indeed the way the EU was going, I wasn't sure why Turkey would want to be in anymore, because there are so many problems. But that if I were to wake up somehow, like Ruth Van Winkle, go to sleep and wake up 10, 15, 20 years later, and the first thing I saw was a headline that said Turkey was in the EU, I wouldn't be surprised. Anything can happen in a situation where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's that kind of situation. So it's a fascinating country. I mean, this is a really interesting subject. I don't have to bore you too much, but it really is an interesting country. And the relationships in the region and with the EU and with the United States, and now with Russia, bear watching, because it's a soap opera that is going to continue. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be delighted to, I think you probably all need to go home, but if any of you would like to talk about this afterwards or sometime in the office while I'm here, I hope to be in the office tomorrow, depending on the snow situation. I've got an absolutely full calendar, unfortunately, but I hope to be here. And it's been really fun to be back at Rutgers again. Thank you.